Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that's been in the news lately, but it's one of those things that's actually been around for quite a long time, and that's the idea of toxic empathy, or sometimes even called suicidal empathy. Now, this isn't to go against people who are empathetic, and that's because it's a normal thing to think about other people's feelings and care for them, but it's the idea of pushing it to the point where you are so concerned about someone else's feelings that you disregard everyone else's and the damage that you do. So before we go too far into that rabbit hole, let's step back, as we typically do, and look at the words and try to understand what we're talking about. So whenever we talk about empathy, you'll see the P-A-T-H in there, the path that's in there. That's the part that's important to think about, because when you look at Aristotle's three modes of rhetoric, you have logos, you have ethos, and you have pathos. Logos, that's where your logic is, logos, logic, logos, word, that kind of thing. So whenever you see things like the study of something, you see an ology, a logos, so you're seeing and understanding that reason and logic that comes along with that. Ethics, of course, you're dealing with, when you see ethos, it's, ethics come to mind, and you think of how somebody is grounded. You think of how someone is virtuous, someone thinks of people with goodwill, someone has practical wisdom. Those are the hallmarks of an ethical person, an ethical speaker. And then you get to pathos, and that is the dealing with emotion. Now, whenever you look at these as modes of rhetoric, we're thinking of the idea of basically of persuasion, the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. That's the definition that Aristotle had for rhetoric. So you're thinking of, well, what's available to me in this particular situation to persuade somebody? I've got an ethical grounding, sure, but I also have the idea of, here's where I stand with a logical plea, and here's where I stand with an emotional plea. And if you watch your TV commercials, you'll see which way they tend to push. So when they talk about something being, much more, full, the commercial being full of logical reasoned statements, they're going heavy on the logos. If they're doing a lot of emotional pleas, they're heavy on the pathos. So you see that as kind of a wrestling point that comes in between how we come up with ways to try to persuade people. And it's the same thing kind of happens whenever you're trying to persuade someone else. Like, you think, okay, when I go into this situation talking with this person in this moment, maybe it's better to rest more on emotion and use an emotional appeal than a logical one, where some people respond better to a logical appeal. And I often tell my students, if you need to borrow $20, who do you talk to? Some say mom, some say dad. There's no rhyme or reason. They just choose, just have their choice. I said, well, why? And then we start breaking down and understanding, like, oh, okay, so when I go to dad, I need to use this kind of appeal to get to him. And if I go talk to mom, I need this kind of appeal to get to her. And we see that kind of breakdown happen all the time. Now, typically, men work more through the idea of a logical appeal. Men are more logos-centric, and women are more of an emotional appeal. They're more pathos-centric. So men look at reason and try to work their way, problem solve, get through things, whereas women are very good at interpersonal relationships and understanding how to communicate well with other people to get to the heart of the matter that way. So when you start looking at the idea of empathy, you can see the idea of emotion and being a key and central figure for that term. Now, it's also, to be clear, we've got a very similar term in our language, sympathy. So we have empathy and sympathy, and you might wonder, well, what's the difference? I don't know if I've ever really thought too much about it. And frankly, I didn't either until I looked it up one day, because I'd have students asking, and, well, let's dig in and find out. So sympathy, well, again, you break down, both of them have the pathy in there, so they're both pathos-centric, but one has sim as the prefix, and that means with. So if you think with empathy, so the idea of, if I have sympathy For example, both of my grandparents have died. They're long deceased. So if I have a student whose grandparent passes away, I can sympathize with that student because I've been there. I've lost a grandparent and I know what that's like. Now, I might not know exactly that situation because everyone's different in how their grandparents pass away and their relationships they have with their grandparents. Setting all that aside, I still know what it's like to lose a grandparent. I've felt that. I've experienced those emotions. My mother is still alive. So if I have a student or a colleague who loses a mother, I don't know what that's like because I've never experienced that. I've lost loved ones. I've lost my grandmother, but I haven't lost my mother. So I can imagine what the emotional toll would be like. I can imagine the emotional impact that would have. That's much more empathy. So if I've been there and I can actually feel that with you, that's much more towards sympathy, with pathy, with emotion, as opposed to empathy, is more just focused on just knowing that emotion or understanding it, at least being able to picture it and grasp it. Again, not necessarily knowing it for sure. But anyway, so the desire to feel for someone else and their plight is a normal thing. I mean, you would be a very callous human being if you didn't feel for another person's plight. So someone's having a difficult time. If you laugh at them, there's something wrong with you. Someone loses somebody and you laugh at them, you're a monster. So, I mean, the point is that we should care for our fellow humans. I mean, you don't even have to be a religious scholar to get that one. But, from Christianity's standpoint, we're supposed to love our neighbors. We're supposed to even love our enemies. So to feel for what the other person's going through, we should understand that. You see this very often, even in military, circles. The wars happen and there's fighting between countries, but at the end of the day, troops on one side, after a battle's over, they recognize that they're doing their job too. And there's a parent who's just lost a son, and they recognize that, which is why after wars you can see military people from both sides, even get together and even maybe even possibly even become friends. It's a weird thing because we don't have that kind of understanding because we're not in that moment. But to be able to have that, to be able to switch from I must kill you because that's my job to actually I recognize the damage that's being done here, and that's terrible. So like you sink another Navy's ship and you still salute as it goes down because you recognize that sacrifice and that loss. So you have the idea of empathy, and we kind of get that. We now have that worked out and ironed out. Great. Now, what does it mean to be toxic or suicidal? How do you get from just I care for you to the point of being toxic about it? Well, quite simply, there are multiple sides to every story. You almost never have two sides. We like to say, oh, you always have to listen to both sides. Well, there's usually way more than both. So there's lots of stuff that's going on in any situation. It can, again, when we talk about pathos and we're talking about emotion, we don't want to think only sad, only negative, even though I was just using the wartime example as an extreme negative. Anytime you're looking at any emotion, so it could be happiness, it could be sadness, it could be anger, it could be fear, whatever the emotion happens to be. But if I'm looking at the idea of caring about your emotion, which is good, but then I cross that line to where I'm so concerned with you and what you're going through that I start to either forget about or discount what other people in that situation, how it affects them. So I see somebody who's going through a rough time and I feel badly for them. no problem. But when I feel badly for them to the expense of maybe that person has actually hurt other people too, and I kind of ignore them or put them aside, that's toxic empathy. So, for example, in this country, we have borders, as do every country has borders. Every country enforces those borders. So when you have people who violate those borders, and they, in our U.S. code of law, we call them illegal aliens, and you can call them undocumented migrants or whatever you wish to call them. When they come into this country, what's the appropriate way of handling it? How do you deal with it? Well, in your house, if someone broke into your home, you would call the police and you would have them removed. Well, if I'm empathetic, I would say, wow, you broke into my house. Why did you do that? Are you hungry? Do you need a place to stay? What's the situation? Or were you just here to steal stuff? Or what's going on? And that's a very base level. Now imagine if your neighbor came in and said, someone broke in your house? That poor person. Boy, they probably just needed food. I hope you let them stay. You let them stay, right? Because they should stay. They have to stay. You have to house them now. In fact, you have to let them basically be part of your family now. I mean, that sounds ridiculous on its face, but that's what toxic empathy does. So having empathy for somebody who's homeless, for someone who's hungry, whatever, that's a noble thing to do. I mean, it's very noble to have that. But then when you just totally bypass it, your neighbor's house was broken into, and now you're compounding that by demanding that they take care of them and everything too. You can see that becoming a quick problem. And that's not just with illegal immigrants, it's with any kind of law-breaking situation. Like you'll see somebody who does something horrible, and instead of saying the poor victim, they'll turn to the perpetrator and say, well, how is this person a victim too? And then they'll focus on that person being a victim to the point of they're even discounting the person who was attacked. You'll see this very often in news stories. Open up any news site, open up any newspaper if you can still get your hands on one, and you'll see instances of that where somebody who was the perpetrator is somehow now being portrayed as the victim. And this is, we used to have a term for whenever we would go after the victim, and we'd have like victim shaming and say you brought it upon yourself and all that stuff. But instead of doing that, the focus is now shifted towards the perpetrator and say, well, yes, they committed a crime, but. And that's when you first start hearing those words start to come in, because after the but, here comes all the words where they start to show all of these things that this person has done and what drove them to do it. Because, I mean, on one hand, on a logical side, you can see why people would want to know what causes someone to commit a crime, whether it's illegally crossing a border, breaking into a house, clear up to committing murder. What causes someone to do that? I remember very much so, all the way back to, several years ago. I was considerably younger, as most of us were, if you were even alive, depending how old you are watching this. But the Columbine school shooting, you had 2 students who shot up their school, and it was the first real gripping the national headlines school shooting, and because it was in a well-to-do area, and it was just one of those things that people just didn't understand. Like, why would they do this? I mean, they created bombs. They just shot people indiscriminately. It wasn't like a targeted attack. It was just anybody and everybody, and they just shoot wantonly. Thankfully, their bombs didn't work, because otherwise it would have been a catastrophic loss of life. But it was just one of those things that everyone wondered what made them do that. That's normal, to wonder what would make someone do such a thing. We've graduated, if graduated is the right word, because it's actually 20 steps back. It's definitely a regression to the idea of thinking, well, what made someone do that? We should feel badly for them. Whoa, you just crossed a line, because this person just these two students, they killed all of these people. And if you remember, if you were alive, they tried to find anything that they could blame instead of blaming them. So they went after video games because these two were avid first-person shooter video game players. So they thought, it must be the video games. So instead of just saying, actually, these two are psychopaths, they said, well, it must be the video games that caused this. Except, again, logically, you work that through. First-person shooters are the most common video games out there, played by millions upon millions upon millions across the globe. You'd have mass shootings happening all the time if they were truly influential. So, again, logically, with any slight bit of reason, that kind of goes out the window. But again, the idea is I can't bring myself to blame them for doing this. There must be something else I could blame. You can sense that toxic empathy right there. That's when you can tell, here it comes. So the idea then is, I don't want to blame the perpetrator. I want to blame something or someone else for causing that kind of a thing. And that's where we get the whole idea of victim shaming, remember? Because you'd have, say, like a woman gets raped and they say, well, her skirt was too short. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second. You can't blame her for that. I mean, she dressed that way, but the impetus is still on the guy for not raping her. So he's to blame. Blaming her is repulsive. So you can see that idea, though. How do I shift the blame? Because I don't want to blame the guy. Because I think the major problem is we as humans don't want to think of ourselves as fallen, evil creatures. Now, again, from the Christian standpoint, Scripture is very clear. No one is righteous, no one, not one. We're all sinful. So therefore, man's inherently evil and occasionally does good. Whereas the typical humanist view is man is inherently good and occasionally does evil. But then again, when we think of evil, we always try to go to an extreme, like Hitler or Stalin. It's like, but you know what? Each and every one is capable of doing evil things. When was the last time you said something awful about another person? Well, that's not evil, isn't it though? You've damaged them. You've worked to damage their reputation. You've tried to damage their personhood, their agency. That sounds pretty evil. When was the last time you stole something? Oh, that's not evil. Really? Somebody who had their livelihood wrapped up into something and you took it without any kind of permission or any kind of exchange. So you just straight up took it. That sounds evil to me. Again, if ultimate standard is perfection, any kind of mistake you make, any kind of problem that you do is inherently evil. So you can see the idea that when Scripture says no one is good, well, I know lots of good people. No. If the standard's perfection, no one can be good because no one's perfect. And we always like to think, well, that's just a typical thing, to err is human, therefore it's normal. We all make mistakes. But realistically, how many of those things were truly mistakes? They're active choices we've made to make, dumb moves. I've made way more dumb moves than I ever want to admit, and probably will never admit on camera. But then again, that's everyone else. Everyone has their skeletons in their closet, the things that they've done. And, we've all done small things, big things, and everything in between that's really stupid, that's really awful, frankly, evil. We hate seeing ourselves in other people. We hate thinking of ourselves as evil. So therefore, how can I shift the blame? That will make me feel better for the things that I do wrong. Because if that person can be excused, I can be excused. So it's almost like humanists trying to find their salvation, from being evil in excusing someone else. So this is where you get the idea of toxic empathy. I'm so concerned about making sure this person is cared about that I'm discounting everybody else. And you see this extreme damage that can happen. So someone who does some horrific crime and we care to make sure that person's okay, how have they been wronged in their life? What drove them to do that? And then you'll see, some cases, you'll see judges and juries let criminals straight up go. Maybe they won't even charge them. They get arrested and they'll just drop the charges because, well, that person had a rough life and it's not fair. It's like, well, what about the person they beat up or murdered? Well, yeah, I mean, that's okay. That's bad too. But, this person's the one who suffered. It's like, I think you have it really, really backwards, because at the end of the day, the impetus is on the person to not commit a crime, but that empathy kicks in. Oh, we have to make sure they're okay. I mean, you see something like this happen all the time. You'll see a serial killer, they'll go to jail, and all of a sudden they'll get all kinds of fan letters of people who want to marry them. What? Why? They're serial killers. Why would you want to do that? And that's a very common thing in prisons. Yeah, that murderers and things, because people they want to be so empathetic that they just, they even get to the point of idolizing murderers. So that's where we are with the idea of toxic empathy. Again, empathy coming from pathos, which is one of the three modes of rhetoric. It's based on emotion. It's where we get terms like empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is with emotion, so I have a shared emotion with you. But empathy, of course, is focusing on recognizing and noticing other people's emotions and caring for them, which again is a very good thing. It's when I get to the point of saying, you know what? That person's emotions are far more important than everybody else's. And even if that person is guilty, I'm going to make sure that we can find some way to understand and basically take that burden from them to the point where it actively damages the people who have been truly harmed. So toxic empathy, not good. Regular empathy, good. Practice empathy. But empathy, again, you're thinking of everyone involved, not just the person who did a crime. And we should feel badly that people who commit crimes chose to do that, and we should hope that they could get their lives turned around. But we shouldn't do that at the expense of those who were damaged. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in this long anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.